Johnny stretched as he stepped out into the morning sunlight, the quiet hum of the loom mill behind him. The city of Lancaster was unusually still, the kind of stillness that felt unnerving rather than peaceful. The air seemed heavier, yet there was no immediate sign of danger. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, Johnny activated his call sign and ran a quick scan. The results came back blank: no anomalies, no monsters, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, the feeling remained. Something was wrong. Frowning, Johnny muttered to himself, "Free will mode." The call sign pulsed faintly, and the world around him shifted into clarity. Through the lens of ethereal vision, the multiverse threads became visible, shimmering faintly in the air like strands of light. He scanned the city again, his gaze sweeping over the skyline, the streets, and the faint fractures of residual energy still lingering from the Mothman's attack. It wasn't the buildings or the energy that caught his attention, it was the air itself. It shimmered faintly, like heat rising from pavement, though there was no physical distortion. He activated a contamination scan, but the results came back clean. No toxins, no pollutants, nothing unusual. And yet, Johnny narrowed his eyes. What the hell is going on? Still unsettled, Johnny headed back inside the loom mill. The hum of activity was faint as the rest of the team stirred awake. The orphan was sprawled across a makeshift couch in the corner, still asleep, while Shade was hunched over the console, muttering to himself as he worked on calibrating the scanners. Johnny bypassed them and headed to the mill's library, a room packed with scavenged books, journals, and digital files collected from across timelines. If the call sign wasn't giving him answers, maybe old-fashioned research would. He combed through the shelves, scanning titles on cryptids, multiversal anomalies, and atmospheric disturbances. He found journals from past Vandukes, including logs from the hunter and even fragments from the original storyteller's accounts. Nothing mentioned shimmering air or invisible anomalies like this. Slamming a book shut in frustration, Johnny muttered, "There's got to be something. I can feel it." He pulled up a chair and rifled through a stack of documents, skimming page after page. A few notes on strange weather patterns, a passing mention of unexplained energy shifts in nearby towns, but nothing concrete. Every source seemed to skirt around the phenomenon, as if whatever he was looking for was deliberately left out of the records. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. This doesn't make sense. No contamination, no scans, no records, but I know something's off. I can feel it. The door creaked open, and the orphan stumbled in, yawning. He flopped into a chair opposite Johnny, resting his feet on the table. "Morning. You look like you've been punched by a cryptid. What's eating you?" Johnny shot him a look but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward the stack of books. "The air. It feels wrong." The orphan tilted his head, curious. "Wrong how?" Like, something's gonna jump out and kill us wrong, or Lancaster's been flipped into another dimension wrong. Johnny sighed. I don't know. It's just different. The call sign isn't picking anything up, but when I activated free will mode, I saw something. The air's shimmering, like heat, but it's not hot. No contamination, no multiversal anomalies, nothing. It's like it's there and not there at the same time. The orphan's grin faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful expression. Huh. That's new. Maybe you're seeing something deeper like the multiverse bleeding through. Or maybe. He trailed off, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Johnny leaned forward. Or maybe what? The orphan hesitated, then shrugged. Or maybe it's nothing. Just leftover weirdness from the Nexus fight. You know how these things can linger. Johnny wasn't convinced. He closed the book in front of him and stood. I'm not leaving this alone. If there's something out there, we need to figure it out before it becomes another crisis. The orphan smirked, leaning back in his chair. You know, for a guy who didn't care about anything a few months ago, you've turned into quite the warrior. Johnny shot him a dry look. Somebody has to. The orphan chuckled but didn't argue, watching as Johnny left the library. Alone again, Johnny's unease grew. The shimmering air, the lack of records, the silence from the call sign, it all felt deliberate, like something was hiding just out of reach. And whatever it was, Johnny had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. Johnny slammed the last book shut with a sigh of frustration. His eyes burned from hours of reading, and his patience was wearing thin. The library offered no answers, just dead ends and half-baked theories. Feeling restless, he pushed back his chair and left the library, heading outside. The cool morning air hit him as he climbed onto the loom mill's rooftop. The sun hung low over Lancaster, casting a golden glow over the city. Johnny leaned on the edge of the roof, letting his mind wander as he stared out at the skyline. His gaze drifted over the buildings, some still battered from the chaos of the Mothman's attack, before settling on the street below. A few cars passed by, the usual early morning traffic weaving through the roads. It was mundane, almost comforting until one car, a small sedan, suddenly stopped in the middle of the street. No warning, no reason, just a dead stop. Johnny squinted, watching it closely. The car didn't move, and no one got out. A chill ran down his spine. Something wasn't right. Johnny climbed down from the roof and jogged to street level. The air felt heavier as he approached the car, the same strange sensation he'd felt earlier. He peered through the windows, expecting to find a driver slumped over or struggling with the vehicle. Nothing. The car was empty. Johnny froze, his pulse quickening. He circled the car, scanning it from every angle. No signs of tampering, no busted windows, no doors ajar. It was as if the car had driven itself to the spot and stopped. "Free will mode," he muttered. The call sign activated, and the world shifted into sharper focus. The faint shimmer he'd seen earlier in the air now enveloped the entire vehicle. It pulsed and twisted, like an invisible force crawling over the metal and glass. Whatever this was, it wasn't just lingering in the air, it was infesting the car. "What the hell?" Johnny muttered. He turned and scanned the street lights, the other parked cars, the buildings nearby. The shimmer was there too, faint but unmistakable. It clung to the street lights, crawled along the power lines, and wrapped itself around other vehicles like a web of invisible tendrils. He deactivated free will mode, and the shimmer disappeared from view, but the unsettling feeling remained. Johnny hurried back to the loom mill, his mind racing. He checked the building's systems, his hands moving quickly over the console. He activated free will mode again, scanning the mill's electronics, the generators, the filtration systems. Nothing. The shimmer wasn't there. Johnny leaned back, relief mixing with confusion. "Either the filters are keeping it out," he muttered to himself, "or this thing can't infest multiversal tech." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. Whatever this was, it was spreading through Lancaster, infesting anything connected to the city's infrastructure. And it wasn't just lingering, it was growing. Back inside, Johnny gathered the team. The others quickly noticed his tension, their conversations fading as they gathered around him. "What's going on?" Ren asked, gripping her spear. Johnny wasted no time. "Something's wrong with the air, it's infesting electronics across the city. I saw it on the street lights, cars, power lines, it's everywhere." Shade frowned, crossing his arms. "Infesting? How?" "I don't know," Johnny admitted. "I used free will mode. The shimmer I noticed earlier, it's not just floating around, it's in everything. But it hasn't touched the loom mill systems. Either our filtration's holding, or this thing can't touch multiversal tech." The orphan whistled, leaning back against a wall. "That's a hell of a detail. If it can't infest multiversal tech, that's an itch." Ren tilted her head, her tone sharp. "But what is it?" "Contamination. A multiversal bleed. A monster we don't know about." Scotty groaned, running a hand through his hair. "Please don't say it's a new monster." Johnny gestured toward the library and the consoles. "We don't know enough. Start digging books, journals, network logs, anything. We need answers before this thing spreads any further." Shade nodded, already heading to the console. "I'll cross-reference it with any anomalies reported in other timelines. Maybe there's a pattern." The orphan smirked faintly. "Guess it's research time again." "All right, boss, let's see what we can dig up." The team scattered, diving into books, data feeds, and the call sign network's archives. Johnny lingered for a moment, his gaze drifting back to the console. The shimmer, the infestation, it wasn't just random. It felt deliberate, purposeful, like a silent invader creeping through the cracks of the city. Whatever it was, Johnny knew they had to stop it. And this time, they might not be dealing with a monster, they might be facing something far more insidious. Johnny stood at the center of the control room, pacing as the others combed through their respective resources. The tension was thick, the air humming with the weight of unanswered questions. Orphan suddenly sat upright, his eyes wide with a spark of realization. "Wait a minute," he said, snapping his fingers. "I've got an idea." Ren looked up from her stack of books. "Let's hear it." Orphan grinned, leaning forward. "We don't have all the answers here, right? But the call sign network isn't just limited to our timeline. We can use it to search for similar anomalies in other timelines, cross-reference this corrupted air's characteristics." Shade tilted his head, intrigued. "You're saying we should search the multiverse for this thing?" Orphan nodded enthusiastically. "Exactly. Infects electronics, can't touch biological beings, manipulates the air, acts like a virus but only targets tech, and isn't multiversal. That's a pretty specific profile. If this thing exists elsewhere, VCSN can find it?" Johnny folded his arms, his expression skeptical but curious. "And how does that help us here?" Orphan's grin widened. "Easy. We time jump." The room fell silent for a beat, the weight of the suggestion settling over them. Ren raised an eyebrow. "Time jump? You're suggesting we just hop into another timeline?" "Why not?" Orphan said, leaning back with a shrug. "We use VCSN to pinpoint a timeline where this thing has already shown up and see how they dealt with it, or if they even could. Maybe we find answers, maybe we don't, but it's better than sitting here guessing." Scotty groaned. "You're crazy. Time jumping into an unknown situation? That's asking for trouble." Orphan rolled his eyes. "We're already neck-deep in trouble, Scotty. This is just leveling the playing field." Johnny glanced at the glowing call sign on his arm, the faint pulse of multiversal energy, a reminder of its potential. "Time jumping," he said quietly. "I've never done it before." Orphan clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Well, buddy, there's a first time for everything. Trust me, it's a rush." Shade tapped a few keys on the console, his tone cautious. "It's a risky move, but if it works, we might get the information we need to stop this thing. What do you think, Johnny?" Johnny took a deep breath, his mind racing. The thought of jumping into another timeline was daunting, but Orphan was right, they were out of options. He nodded slowly, his jaw set. "Let's do it." Orphan stood, rubbing his hands together. "All right, strap in, everyone. This is going to be one hell of a ride." Johnny turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "How exactly does this work?" Orphan smirked, motioning for him to follow. "Oh, you'll see. Just hold on tight and try not to throw up." The team moved quickly, the air buzzing with nervous energy as they prepared for the jump. Johnny stood at the center of the room, his call sign glowing brighter as the network began to hum with power. This was it, his first leap into the unknown. The world around them materialized in a flash of light, the disorienting pull of the time jump leaving everyone momentarily dazed. Johnny blinked, his senses scrambling to adjust. The first thing he noticed was the silence, absolute, oppressive silence. No wind, no hum of city life, nothing. His chest tightened instinctively, and he reached for his call sign. "Wait!" Ren shouted, her voice muffled. "Why can't I breathe?" Scotty stumbled, his hands flying to his throat in panic. Shade clutched the console he had brought through the jump, his face pale as realization set in. There was no atmosphere, no air to breathe. The orphan stepped forward, calm and steady, his voice cutting through the panic. "Relax. The call signs have got you covered. They're designed for this." Johnny nodded, tapping his own glowing call sign. "He's right. Just breathe normally. The call signs are filtering oxygen straight into our systems." Ren hesitated, testing a shallow breath. Her eyes widened as she realized it worked. "That's weird." Scotty exhaled sharply, his relief obvious. "Next time, maybe warn us about that first." The orphan shrugged with a grin. "Where's the fun in that?" Johnny didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the world around him. This place, this version of Lancaster, was nothing like their home. The streets were overgrown, but not with plants. Instead, wires and biological tissue twisted and sprawled across every surface like grotesque veins. Buildings were misshapen, their structures warped and pulsing faintly, as though alive. "What the hell is this place?" Johnny muttered, stepping cautiously over a patch of glistening, fleshy ground. Ren leaned on her spear, her expression tense. "This is supposed to be Lancaster? This doesn't look like anywhere on Earth." The orphan knelt beside a puddle of water pooled in a cracked street. The liquid shimmered unnaturally, its surface rippling in patterns that didn't match any natural behavior. He tapped his call sign, running a scan. "This isn't water, it's alive." "Sort of." Shade crouched next to him, his call sign glowing faintly as he reviewed the scan results. "Alive in what way?" The orphan frowned, studying the data. "It's electronic. Artificial intelligence, maybe. But it's contaminated with the same thing that infected our timeline." Johnny scanned the area, his call sign glowing brighter as he activated free will mode. His eyes widened as the shimmering air he had seen earlier now blanketed everything. The wires, the tissue, the twisted buildings, it was all infected. "This whole place is wrong," Johnny said, his voice low. "Everything here, everything is contaminated. The streets, the buildings, even the air itself. It's all connected to the same corruption we saw in Lancaster." Scotty stared at the warped remains of a car, its frame fused with what looked like muscle tissue. The vehicle quivered faintly, like it was alive and in pain. "What the hell happened here?" Ren's grip on her spear tightened. Whatever it was, it wasn't natural. "This is wrong. Everything about this is wrong." Johnny stepped forward, his eyes scanning the horizon. The jungle of wires and flesh stretched endlessly, the once familiar landmarks of Lancaster unrecognizable beneath the corruption. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Is this even Lancaster anymore?" he asked quietly. "Or did we land in something else entirely?" The orphan straightened, his usual grin replaced by a serious expression. "If this is what our Lancaster could become, we're in deeper trouble than we thought." Johnny activated his call sign, his voice steady but laced with unease. "VCSN, identify the timeline. Where are we?" The call sign hummed for a moment, the glow on Johnny's arm intensifying as it processed the request. Then, the voice came through, cold and unfeeling. "Timeline 54. The words sent a chill through the group. Ren shifted uncomfortably, her spear glinting faintly in the strange, warped light. "Timeline 54? What's that supposed to mean?" Johnny glanced at the orphan, who had gone quiet, his usual smirk gone. "VCSN, give us a history of this timeline." The call sign responded immediately, its tone grim and mechanical. "Timeline 54. Divergent timeline. Late 1980s through the year 2000. The United States and multiple global powers, including Canada, China, and Russia, engaged in an escalating arms race. This timeline's divergence stems from the early rise of computer technology in the 1970s, leading to experimental programs aimed at evolving and controlling technology through biological means. Scotty's eyes widened. "Biological tech? Like organic computers?" "Correct," the call sign continued. "These programs, initially concentrated in the eastern United States, what was historically known as the original 13 states, began as an effort to control electronics at the biological and atomic level. Over the following decades, the concept evolved into a worldwide arms race. By the late 1990s, numerous nations had developed competing versions of what came to be known as Project 54. Ren frowned. "Project 54? What's that?" The call sign paused, then resumed, its tone carrying a sense of finality. "Project 54, codename for the Techno-Bacterial Virus. A self-replicating biological electronic hybrid designed to infect and control electronic systems from within. Its purpose was to render enemy technology useless while enhancing its host systems. By the year 2000, competing nations launched secret operations to deploy their versions of Project 54. Shade's face darkened as the gravity of the information settled over them. Let me guess. It didn't go as planned. The call sign confirmed his suspicion. At the onset of the secret conflict, all nations involved simultaneously lost control of their respective versions of the Techno-Bacterial Virus. The biological electronic hybrids mutated beyond their original programming, spreading uncontrollably through systems, devices, and infrastructure worldwide. Johnny's voice was low, almost a whisper. And then, the Techno-Bacterial Virus consumed all technology it encountered, integrating biological material from the environment and its hosts. Cities, vehicles, weapons, everything was infected. The virus did not distinguish between civilian and military assets. Within months, it rendered the global population extinct, leaving behind only the corrupted remnants of its existence. The orphan let out a low whistle, his tone dry but uneasy. So, we landed in the timeline where humanity nuked itself with the technovirus. Fantastic. Ren stared at the warped structures around them, her grip tightening on her spear. And now it's just this. A world of wires, flesh, and machines growing out of everything. This is what's left. The call sign added a final, chilling note. The Techno-Bacterial Virus continues to evolve in Timeline 54. It has no purpose, no directive, and no limits. Its growth is exponential. Johnny clenched his fists, his call sign glowing faintly as he stared at the grotesque landscape. This isn't just a dead timeline. It's a warning. Johnny and the group stood silent, their faces pale as the call sign prepared to answer their next question. The hum of the device seemed to grow heavier, as if even VCSN hesitated to relay the grim reality of Timeline 54. What happened after the virus was deployed? Johnny asked, his voice quiet but firm. How did it destroy everything? The call sign's voice cut through the eerie silence, its tone clinical and emotionless. Following the deployment of Project 54 in 2000, the Techno-Bacterial Virus evolved exponentially. Within 1 year, it adapted to spread through the air, infecting electronic systems at a molecular level. By 2001, it had begun infiltrating major infrastructure systems in its countries of origin, starting with the stock market. Ren frowned, gripping her spear tightly. The stock market? Why start there? The virus targeted systems of economic stability first, spreading chaos and disarray. From there, it infected hospital networks, disrupting critical care systems and leading to mass casualties. Media systems followed, enabling the virus to manipulate communication on a global scale. Scotty swallowed hard, his eyes wide. Media and hospitals? That's horrifying. The call sign continued, its voice unrelenting. Public transportation systems were among the next targets. Vehicles such as taxis, buses, planes, and trains became tools of the virus. Systems with minimal or purely mechanical components, those lacking advanced digital or wired integrations, were the only ones to remain partially functional. However, they, too, were not immune to minor disruptions. Johnny tightened his grip on his magnum, his expression grim. So it didn't stop. It just kept spreading. Correct. In September of 2001, the virus used its control over public transport and communication systems to orchestrate events of catastrophic scale. Historical events in this timeline, such as the September 11th attacks, were directly manipulated by the virus as part of its escalation. The room grew colder at the implication, the weight of those words crushing any lingering hope that this was a simple anomaly. Johnny's hands shook as he pressed forward. And after that, by 2007, the Techno-Bacterial Virus had rendered the entire east coast of the United States uninhabitable. Cities were overrun by infected infrastructure. Streets, vehicles, buildings, and utilities became hosts for the virus, growing into amalgamations of organic and technological corruption. Ren shook her head, her voice trembling. And the rest of the world? Did anyone fight back? Attempts were made. However, by 2014, the infection had spread globally. Entire nations fell as the virus consumed their technology and biological materials. Humanity's efforts to counteract the virus were fragmented and inadequate. By the early 2020s, EMP technology provided a temporary foothold, allowing small groups of survivors to resist the virus's influence. Shade frowned, his tone skeptical. If they had EMPs, why didn't they win? The call sign's response was swift and final. By the time EMP technology was deployed effectively, Earth's natural resources had been neutralized. The virus's rapid consumption of the environment left no infrastructure, no ecosystems, and no remaining supplies for humanity to rebuild. The last human perished in the early 2030s. The remnants of the virus persisted, unaffected by EMPs, and now dominate the Earth in Timeline 54. Scotty slumped against a nearby wall, his shotgun hanging limply at his side. So, this isn't just a dead world. It's a graveyard. A graveyard for humanity. The orphan let out a low whistle, crossing his arms. I hate to say it, but this is probably the darkest thing we've come across yet. A timeline where humanity literally engineered its own extinction. Ren stepped closer to Johnny, her expression filled with both anger and fear. What do we do with this, Johnny? What's the plan? If this virus exists here, could it find a way to our timeline? Johnny's eyes stayed locked on the horizon, where the jungle of wires and biological tissue twisted over the remains of what had once been a thriving city. We figure out how it works, he said firmly. We figure out what went wrong, and we make damn sure it doesn't happen in our timeline. The weight of Timeline 54's history pressed down on the group as they processed what they had learned. The air felt heavier than ever, as if the corrupted world around them knew they were intruders. As grim as the story was, Johnny couldn't help but feel it was more than a warning. It was a test, a challenge for them to rise above and protect their own timeline from suffering a similar fate. The team gathered near the spot where they'd landed, taking in the grotesque, corrupted landscape of Timeline 54 one last time. The twisted wires and biological growths pulsed faintly, casting eerie shadows over the streets. The air felt heavier than ever, as if the world itself was suffocating under the weight of its own corruption. Johnny turned to the others, his jaw set. "Let's get out of here." VCSN, one last question. What could have caused a non-multiversal anomaly like this virus to infect our timeline? The call sign hummed faintly, processing the query. Then, in a flat, mechanical tone, it delivered its response. "Error." Johnny's brow furrowed. "Error? What does that mean?" The call sign remained silent. No further explanation came, only the cold, unyielding message, "Error." Ren crossed her arms, her expression dark. "Great. So we still don't know how this thing crossed timelines." Scotty muttered under his breath. As if this whole trip wasn't creepy enough. Johnny sighed. "We'll figure it out later. For now, let's jump back." VCSN, initiate time jump. The call sign hummed to life, the multiversal energy surrounding them in a faint glow as the jump sequence began. The world of Timeline 54 dissolved into blinding light, and for a moment, everything was still. When the light faded, the team found themselves standing in a large, dimly lit space. The air smelled faintly of oil and rust, and the hum of dormant machinery filled the room. It was immediately clear they weren't back at the loom mill. Johnny groaned, rubbing his temples. "Right. Forgot about this. The call sign doesn't always land you exactly where you want to go." The orphan grinned, adjusting his magnum. "Keeps things interesting, doesn't it?" Shade activated a flashlight, illuminating rows of industrial shelving filled with old computers, servers, and tangled wires. "Looks like a tech warehouse," he muttered. "East side of Lancaster, maybe." Ren stepped closer to one of the shelves, her spear at the ready. "Yeah, but why here? What's special about this place?" Before anyone could answer, the lights in the warehouse flickered, then dimmed. A low, mechanical hum echoed through the space, followed by the faint sound of gears grinding. Johnny's call sign glowed faintly as he activated free will mode. "Everyone stay alert," he said, his voice sharp. "Something's not right." The orphan drew his magnum, spinning the cylinder idly. "Not right? This place is screaming trap." As the hum grew louder, the machinery around them began to stir. Monitors flickered to life, their screens displaying static interspersed with flickers of distorted images. Robotic arms mounted on the walls twitched, their joints creaking as they slowly turned toward the group. Shade stepped back, his voice tense. Johnny. The tech's waking up. Scotty gripped his shotgun tightly, his eyes wide. What's making it do that? I thought this timeline didn't have any of that techno-virus crap. Johnny's call sign pulsed brighter as he scanned the room. I don't know. But whatever's happening, it's targeting us. The shelves rattled as wires and cables snaked out from the shadows, their movements deliberate and predatory. One of the monitors flickered, its screen displaying a single, chilling word. Welcome. Ren raised her spear, her stance defensive. I don't think we're welcome here. The machinery around them surged to life, the grinding of gears and the whirring of motors filling the space. The group fell into formation, their weapons drawn as the tech in the warehouse began to move, surrounding them. Johnny raised his magnum, his call sign glowing fiercely. Looks like we're not leaving just yet. Get ready to fight. The team braced themselves as the dormant technology of the warehouse came alive, surging toward them with relentless, mechanical precision. Whatever force had awoken the machines, it was clear it wasn't about to let them leave without a fight. The warehouse erupted into chaos as the dormant machinery sprang to life. Robotic arms lashed out, wires slithered like serpents, and monitors flickered with distorted static as if mocking the team. Johnny and the others moved with precision, their weapons and training turning the chaotic environment into a battlefield. The orphan darted through the chaos, his magnum blazing as he laughed maniacally. Oh, come on. Is that all you've got? This is just like old times back at the pizzeria. He leapt onto a table, his boots smashing down on an old terminal as wires reached for him. He shot a cluster of cables snaking toward Johnny, his grin widening. But let me tell you something, Project 50, or whatever you want to call yourself, you ain't got nothing on those nightmares. The orphan flipped backward off the table, blasting a robotic arm midair before landing in a crouch. His laughter echoed through the warehouse, a sharp contrast to the grinding, whirring sounds of the machines. As he moved, his focus sharp and his confidence high, a voice crackled faintly through the chaos. The sound was almost lost in the noise of battle, but it pierced through like an icy dagger. Remember me, orphan. The voice was cold, metallic, and unmistakably familiar. The orphan froze mid-step, his eyes narrowing as the words cut through his adrenaline. His breath caught in his throat, and for a split second, the chaos of the warehouse faded away, replaced by a flood of memories he'd worked hard to bury. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, it can't be. The voice crackled again, this time from a speaker embedded in the wall. Its tone was mocking, twisted with a cruel sense of satisfaction. You can't forget me, orphan. You know I'll always find you. Rage flared in the orphan's eyes as he whipped around, his magnum raised. Without hesitation, he fired 3 shots into the speaker, silencing the voice in an explosion of sparks and metal. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice raw with anger. "You're not real. You're not supposed to be here." The others noticed his outburst, their movements slowing as they glanced his way. Ren called out, her tone cautious. "Orphan, what's wrong? Who are you yelling at?" But the orphan didn't respond. His mind raced, the voice echoing in his head. It couldn't be back, it shouldn't be back. He had left that horror behind in his own timeline, buried under layers of fire, rubble, and rage. He clenched his teeth, forcing himself to focus. The wires and machines were still attacking, still moving, but the voice, its presence lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. "I don't have time for this," he growled under his breath, firing at another tangle of wires as he fought his way back to the others. Inside, his thoughts churned. "It can't be them. They're gone. I made sure of it." But the voice, it was too familiar, too real. As he moved through the chaos, he silently vowed to find out what was going on. If this was connected to the nightmares he'd left behind, then it wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs. And he wasn't about to let the horrors of his past infect this timeline without a fight. The warehouse seemed to shudder, the machinery groaning as if responding to an unseen command. The grinding of gears and the whir of electronics stuttered for a moment, then fell silent. The team froze mid-fight, their weapons still raised, eyes darting around the dim, flickering space. And then, the voice came. It wasn't just in the speakers this time. It was everywhere, emanating from the machines, vibrating in the walls, even reverberating through the air itself. Cold, metallic, and dripping with malice, it rang out with a chilling declaration. "You can't kill me, Vanduke. I always come back." The voice hit like a thunderclap, the sheer weight of it forcing the team into silence. Johnny's grip tightened on his magnum, his call sign glowing faintly as he scanned the room. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, his voice low but firm. The orphan's face paled, his usual bravado replaced by a mixture of rage and fear. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, no, no. This isn't happening." Ren stepped closer to Johnny, her spear at the ready. "Did it just call you Vanduke? What is this thing?" The voice laughed, a cold, grating sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You know who I am. You've always known. Imposter. False storyteller, call me what you will. I am the shadow you cannot escape, the truth you cannot deny. I am the reason you exist, Vanduke. And I will be the one to end you." Johnny's call sign flared brighter as he stepped forward, his jaw set. "We ended you. The war's the multiversal chaos, it's over. You were destroyed." The voice growled, its tone sharpening into a venomous sneer. Destroyed. Oh, Vanduke, you should know better than that. I am not bound by time. I am not bound by death. As long as there are timelines, as long as there are stories to twist and lives to take, I will exist. The orphan clenched his fists, his magnum trembling in his hand. You're not supposed to be here, he growled. You're gone. We beat you. The voice chuckled, its malice cutting through the air like a blade. Did you? Or did I let you think you won? You, of all people, should know better, orphan. You've seen what I can do. Do you truly think you're free of me? Johnny exchanged a glance with Ren and Shade, the unease in their eyes mirroring his own. The false storyteller's presence was overwhelming, the weight of its voice pressing down on them like a physical force. The machines around them began to stir again, their movements more deliberate, almost predatory. Scotty swallowed hard, his shotgun shaking slightly. Johnny, what do we do? Is this thing, this false storyteller, for real? Johnny took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. For now, we fight. Whatever this thing is, we're not giving it the satisfaction of seeing us run. The voice erupted into mocking laughter, its tone filled with cruel delight. Oh, you'll fight. You'll struggle. And you'll lose. Just like all the others. You think you've won this timeline? You think you're safe in your loom mill, your precious call sign network? You're nothing but pawns in my game. And soon, you'll see what real fear looks like. The machines surged forward again, wires lashing out like living tendrils as the team braced themselves. But even as they fought, the voice lingered, whispering, mocking, and taunting them with every move. You cannot kill me, Vanduke. I always come back. The battle raged on, but Johnny's mind raced. If the false storyteller had truly returned, then everything they had fought for, everything they believed they had won, was at risk. And this time, the stakes felt higher than ever. But that's when something happened. The air around the team shifted as the call sign network flared to life, its glow intensifying until it bathed the warehouse in brilliant, pulsating light. The machines around them froze mid-attack, their wiry tendrils recoiling as if struck by an unseen force. The hum of the call sign grew louder, resonating like a voice rising from the depths of time itself. VCSN online. Connected to main terminal in the den. The voice of the call sign network was unlike anything they had heard before, cold and mechanical, yet filled with an undeniable power. It wasn't just a system anymore. It was alive, a sentinel of the multiverse, and it had something to say. The false storyteller's mocking laughter faltered, replaced by a low growl as the network spoke again, its tone reverberating through the space with authority. You think you're so clever, imposter. You think you can hide your chaos in the shadows. The multiverse flows all at once and not at all at the same time. The machines shuddered, their movements stuttering as if recoiling from the sheer force of the call sign's words. The false storyteller's voice crackled back, filled with venom. "You dare to challenge me, network? I am eternal. I have twisted the multiverse to my will, bent its timelines, and broken its champions. You cannot stop me." The call sign network's glow intensified, its presence overpowering the voice of the false storyteller. The multiversal war is always occurring. Past, present, and future it never ends. And I, VCSN, will never rest. Never sleep. Never forget. Johnny stepped back, shielding his eyes from the brilliant glow. The words seemed to vibrate through his entire being, the call sign on his arm surging with energy as the network continued. "I watch every and all timelines. I have seen everything. The victories. The sacrifices. And I will never forget." The voice shifted, taking on a tone of reverence, almost mournful, as it spoke of the past. "I will never forget the sacrifices made by people like the Hell Rider and the Starfield Vanduke. Heroes who fought to protect the innocent, who gave everything to preserve the multiverse." The false storyteller hissed, its voice dripping with disdain. "Sacrifices? Heroes? They were pawns. All of them." The call sign's voice rose, drowning out the false storyteller's retort. "And I will never forget ZAXX, who gave up his free will, his very existence, to merge with my systems. His sacrifice helped turn the tide against your chaos." The orphan froze, his eyes wide as the words washed over him. "Z.A.X.X, he whispered. "I thought that was just a story." Johnny clenched his fists, his jaw set as the network's voice grew louder, its words filled with defiance. "Imposter. False storyteller. You seek to twist the threads of reality, to corrupt the stories that make the multiverse strong. But hear me now, fear the network." The false storyteller's voice crackled, its tone desperate and filled with anger. "You cannot stop me. You cannot win. I will always return." The call sign network's final words rang out like a thunderclap, shaking the very foundation of the warehouse. "Fear the network." The warehouse erupted with light as the network unleashed a wave of energy, surging through the corrupted machines. The wires snapped, monitors exploded, and the robotic arms collapsed into lifeless heaps. The false storyteller's voice howled in rage, fading into static as the call sign's power overwhelmed its presence. When the light finally dimmed, the team stood in stunned silence. The machines were dead, the air eerily still, but the call sign's glow remained steady, a faint reminder of the power they had just witnessed. Johnny exhaled, his voice barely above a whisper. "The network just saved us." The orphan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah. And it just declared war on the false storyteller. Again." Ren lowered her spear, glancing around cautiously. "If the network's stepping in now, This fight's bigger than we thought. What happens next? Johnny stared at his call sign, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes. We fight. For the multiverse. For the sacrifices that came before us. And for the nightmares who need to learn to fear the dark. The team stood in stunned silence, the echo of the call sign network's booming declaration still reverberating in their minds. The machines around them lay in lifeless heaps, their corrupted presence eradicated by the network's overwhelming power. The air hung heavy, charged with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Johnny stared at the faintly glowing call sign on his arm, his voice low and steady. The stories are true. The network, it's alive. The orphan leaned back against a wall, his expression unreadable. Alive, and ready to go to war. Makes you wonder just how much it's been holding back all this time. Ren tightened her grip on her spear, her gaze sharp as she scanned the ruined machinery. If the network's stepping in now, it must mean this contamination is bigger than just a timeline anomaly. We need to know more. Johnny nodded, his mind racing. He activated free will mode, his call sign pulsing with energy. VCSN, he said, his voice firm, where is the main source of the contamination? The call sign network hummed, its glow intensifying as it processed the query. Then, its voice returned, calm but filled with authority. Main source located. Designation, Conestoga Valley. Ren's brow furrowed. Conestoga Valley. That's not far from here. Scotty groaned, shifting uneasily. Great. So we're heading into another hotspot of this nightmare virus. Can't wait. Shade pulled up a map on his handheld console, his call sign syncing with the data. If the contamination's centered there, it might be the origin point or at least the strongest node of the infection. The orphan smirked, spinning his magnum idly. Guess we've got our next stop. Let's see what's waiting for us in the Valley of Nightmares. Johnny clenched his fists, his gaze steady as he turned to the group. This is it. If we're going to stop this thing, we need to go to the source. Gear up, everyone. We're heading to Conestoga Valley. The team exchanged determined glances, their exhaustion fading as resolve took its place. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. With the call sign network's guidance, they would face whatever horrors awaited them in Conestoga Valley. For their timeline, for the multiverse, and for the sacrifices of those who came before them, they would fight. The network's glow dimmed, its presence still felt as they prepared to move out. In the back of Johnny's mind, one thought lingered. If this is the source, what kind of nightmare are we about to walk into? As the team drove toward Conestoga Valley, the weight of the call sign network's revelation hung heavy in the air. The van rattled along the wide roads, the silence inside broken only by the occasional hum of the call sign syncing with nearby data points. Johnny sat in the passenger seat, his eyes scanning the map Shade had projected onto the dashboard. Conestoga Valley, Ren said from the back, twirling her spear absently. Spread out, sparse population, and surrounded by forests and empty roads. If I were a virus trying to stay hidden, this would be the perfect place. Shade nodded, his fingers flying over his console. It makes sense. Minimal population density means less chance of anyone noticing anomalies. Lots of dead space means fewer prying eyes and fewer connections to major infrastructure. Scotty leaned forward, glancing at the map. But why here? Why not a bigger city, where it could spread faster? Johnny's gaze didn't waver from the road ahead. Because this isn't about spreading. Not yet. This is about hiding. The orphan, leaning casually against the side of the van, smirked. Gotta hand it to the imposter teaching the virus to pick the least viable spot for a main hive. That's smart. Annoyingly smart. Ren frowned, her expression darkening. You're saying it chose Conestoga Valley because we wouldn't think to look here? Johnny nodded. Exactly. The virus isn't just evolving, it's learning. It knows we're hunting it. It knows how we think. The imposter must have programmed it to act differently, to stay off our radar for as long as possible. Shade adjusted the map, zooming in on a cluster of buildings surrounded by dense forest. The town's layout plays into its hands, too. Pockets of population, lots of empty space in between. If the virus is concentrated in one of these areas, it's using the forests and roads as natural barriers. The orphan chuckled, spinning his magnum idly. Hiding in plain sight. Clever little bastard. Scotty sighed, leaning back in his seat. So, what's the plan? We just roll into town and hope the call sign points us to the hive. Johnny glanced at him, his expression grim. Not exactly. We'll need to split up. Cover more ground, figure out which part of the valley the hive is hiding in. But we stick to the main roads until we're sure. This place might look quiet, but if the virus is here, it's watching us. The orphan's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a glint of determination. And if it's watching us, that means it's got traps ready. Ren tapped her spear against the floor of the van. Good. Let it try. We'll be ready. As they entered the outskirts of Conestoga Valley, the eerie quiet of the area became even more apparent. The pockets of population were small and scattered clusters of homes and businesses surrounded by vast stretches of forest and winding, empty roads. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Johnny activated free will mode, scanning the area as they drove. The shimmer of the virus's contamination was faint but present, clinging to the edges of the roads and creeping along the outskirts of the scattered buildings. It's here, he said quietly. But it's spread thin. It's keeping itself hidden. Shade adjusted the scanner, his call sign glowing faintly. That means the hive must be concentrated somewhere specific. If we find it, we find the source. The orphan leaned forward, his grin returning. And when we find the source, we burn it to the ground. Johnny didn't respond, his focus locked on the road ahead. The imposter's strategy was clear now, hiding the hive in a place no one would think to look, teaching the virus to spread just enough to stay undetected. It was a clever plan, but Johnny and his team weren't about to let it succeed. As they approached the first cluster of buildings, Johnny gripped his magnum tightly. "Stay sharp," he said. "This thing picked the least viable location for a reason. Let's not underestimate it." The team nodded, their determination evident as they prepared to face whatever horrors awaited them in Conestoga Valley. This was more than a fight against the virus, it was a test of their resolve, their strategy, and their ability to outthink an enemy that had already learned too much. The van slowed as it approached the edge of a small forest clearing, the team studying the scattered buildings of Conestoga Valley through the windshield. Ren leaned forward, squinting as the faint shimmer of the virus's contamination glinted in the sunlight. "Look at that," she said, pointing toward the horizon. "CV High. Biggest building around here." Johnny followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sprawling structure. Conestoga Valley High School loomed over the sparse town, its tall, weathered facade visible even from a distance. The building was old but large, a hub of electronics, classrooms, and infrastructure. Scotty frowned, his shotgun resting on his lap. "That place? It's huge. If the virus wanted a place with a lot of electronics, that'd be the spot." The orphan grinned, his magnum spinning lazily in his hand. "Schools are always a hotbed for weird stuff in timelines like this. Tons of wiring, central systems, servers. It's basically a buffet for something like this." Shade adjusted the console, his call sign glowing faintly as it scanned the area. "He's right. If the virus is looking for a central location to root itself, CV High makes sense. Biggest building in the area, lots of tech to infect, and easy access to the surrounding pockets of population." Johnny's jaw tightened as he considered the possibility. It's also isolated enough to keep from drawing attention. And if it's the main hive, the virus would want somewhere with enough infrastructure to spread its influence quickly if needed. Ren rested her spear against her shoulder, her tone cautious. "So, what's the plan? We just walk in and start shooting?" The orphan chuckled. "Tempting, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. If that place is the hive, it'll be crawling with traps and infected tech." Johnny nodded, his expression grim. "We scout first. Find a way in, see how deep the contamination goes. If CV High is the hive, we're not walking into it blind." Shade tapped a few keys on his console, the scanner shifting to focus on the high school. "I'm picking up faint traces of contamination around the perimeter, but nothing too strong. Either the virus is hiding its presence, or it hasn't fully taken over the building yet. Scotty let out a slow breath. If it's hiding, that means it knows we're coming. Johnny gripped his magnum, his call sign pulsing faintly. Good. Let it know. If CV High is the source of this nightmare, we're shutting it down. For good. The team exchanged determined glances as they prepared to move out. Conestoga Valley High loomed ahead, its size and isolation making it the perfect location for the virus's hive. The quiet tension in the air was palpable as they readied their weapons and gear, knowing the fight ahead would be one of their hardest yet. Stay sharp, Johnny said as they exited the van. Whatever's waiting for us in there, it's not going to go down without a fight. With that, the team began their approach, the shadow of CV High growing larger with every step. The fate of their timeline hung in the balance, and they weren't about to let the virus win. Johnny smirked as the group stood a few hundred yards from CV High, the massive structure looming ahead. He glanced back at the others, gripping the van's keys tightly. I doubt it's going to roll out a red carpet for us, he said. So, let's make our own entrance. Scotty blinked, his shotgun resting on his lap. You're not seriously suggesting? Oh, I am, Johnny interrupted, cutting him off with a grin. We're taking the van straight through the front doors. Fast, loud, and unexpected. If the virus has traps, this'll throw them off. The orphan cackled, climbing into the passenger seat. Now this is the kind of plan I can get behind. Let's see how well their security holds up against 2 tons of metal. Ren raised an eyebrow, her spear slung over her back as she slid into the back seat. This is reckless. But fine. If we're doing this, let's do it right. Shade adjusted the scanner one last time, double-checking the layout of the building. Front doors are reinforced, but if we hit it hard enough, the van should breach them. Just be ready for whatever's on the other side. Scotty groaned, climbing into the van. I hate this plan. I hate this plan so much. Johnny started the engine, the low rumble of the van cutting through the eerie silence of the area. He glanced at the others, his smirk fading into a more serious expression. Hold on tight. This is gonna get messy. The van roared to life, its tires screeching as Johnny floored the gas pedal. The vehicle surged forward, barreling down the road towards CV High. The building grew larger and larger, the faint shimmer of contamination visible as they drew closer. Wires twitched and monitors flickered through the windows, signs of the virus preparing itself. Johnny's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as the front doors came into view. Here we go. The van smashed into the doors with a deafening crash, splintering the reinforced metal and sending shards of glass flying. The force of the impact rocked the vehicle, but the doors gave way, the van plowing through into the darkened interior of the school. Sparks rained down as wires ripped from the ceiling, the sound of grinding machinery echoing through the space. The van screeched to a halt, its headlights illuminating a long, shadowed corridor ahead. The team piled out, weapons drawn, as the building seemed to shudder around them. "Well," the orphan said, reloading his magnum with a grin. "That got their attention." The virus responded immediately. The walls began to pulse, wires slithering out of cracks and wrapping around broken desks and chairs. Monitors flickered to life, their screens filled with static and distorted images. A deep, guttural hum echoed through the building as the hive awoke. Ren raised her spear, her voice sharp. "It's not happy we're here." Johnny cocked his magnum, his call sign glowing faintly. "Good. Let's make it regret letting us in." The team moved forward cautiously, the air thick with tension as the virus began to react to their presence. The hive was alive, and it wasn't about to go down without a fight. But neither were they. The team advanced down the dim corridor, the eerie hum of the hive growing louder with every step. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, the wires slithering along the cracked tiles like serpents. The flickering lights cast distorted shadows that danced across the warped surfaces, giving the entire space an otherworldly feel. Johnny led the way, his magnum drawn and glowing faintly as his call sign pulsed with energy. The orphan followed close behind, his expression a mix of exhilaration and focus, while Ren and Scotty flanked their sides, weapons ready. Shade brought up the rear, his console in hand, scanning for any signs of traps or anomalies. "Shade," Johnny said quietly, his voice low and controlled. "What's the layout looking like?" Shade's call sign glowed faintly as he pulled up a map of the school. "The main server room is just past the cafeteria on the west side. If this place is the hive, that's where the core will be." The orphan smirked, spinning his magnum lazily. "A server room as the brain of a techno-virus hive? How cliché." Ren shot him a look, her grip tightening on her spear. "Focus. If it's cliché, that means it's predictable. And predictable means dangerous." As they turned a corner, the hum intensified, and the air grew heavier. The shimmering contamination Johnny had seen earlier was no longer faint. It clung to the walls and floors in thick, pulsating waves, glowing faintly like veins of molten metal. Scotty's shotgun trembled slightly in his hands. Anyone else feel like this place is watching us?" Johnny didn't look back, his gaze locked on the corridor ahead. "It is. Stay sharp." A monitor on the wall flickered to life, its screen filled with distorted static before a single word appeared in bold, jagged letters. "Welcome." The team froze, their weapons raised as a deep, mechanical laugh echoed through the hall. The voice was cold, dripping with malice, and unmistakable. "You made a bold entrance, Vandukes. But do you really think you can stop me? This hive is alive. It's a part of me. And you're walking straight into its heart." Johnny tightened his grip on his magnum. "We've stopped worse. The voice chuckled, its tone mocking. Have you? This isn't just a virus, Vanduke. It's evolution. And you're already too late. The monitor shattered suddenly, sparks flying as wires burst from the walls, writhing like tendrils toward the group. Johnny fired a quick shot, the glowing bullet severing the wires mid-air, but more surged forward. Move, he shouted, leading the charge as the team sprinted down the corridor. The wires lashed out, wrapping around desks and lockers, pulling them into the path of the team. Ren slashed through a cluster of cables with her spear, the blade sparking as it cut through the writhing mass. The orphan fired his magnum with precision, taking out another monitor as it buzzed to life. Scotty blasted a locker out of the way with his shotgun, clearing a path. How much further, Shade? Shade glanced at his console, his voice steady despite the chaos. 100 feet, give or take. The server room should be just ahead. The walls around them seemed to close in, the wires growing thicker, the lights dimming further. The air felt suffocating, as if the hive itself was trying to crush them. A guttural roar echoed from deeper within, the sound reverberating through the building like the growl of a massive beast. Ren glanced at Johnny, her voice tense. What the hell was that? Johnny didn't answer. He didn't need to. Whatever it was waiting for them in the server room. They burst through the final set of double doors, entering the server room. The space was massive, the walls lined with towers of corrupted hardware. Monitors flickered erratically, their screens filled with distorted images of faces, maps, and symbols that made no sense. The air shimmered with contamination, the glow pulsing like a heartbeat. In the center of the room stood a massive, pulsating structure, a twisted amalgamation of wires, metal, and biological tissue. It pulsed and writhed, its tendrils stretching out into every corner of the room, connecting to the servers and monitors like veins feeding a living organism. Johnny raised his magnum, his voice steady. This is it? The hive. The orphan grinned, spinning his weapon. All right, let's shut this thing down. The ground beneath them trembled, and the voice returned, louder and more menacing than ever. You think you've won, Vandukes? You've only walked into my trap. This is my domain. And here, I am invincible. The hive surged to life, its tendrils snapping toward the team as the room erupted into chaos. The final battle had begun. The hive's tendrils lashed out like serpents, their movements sharp and erratic. The air crackled with energy as sparks flew from the corrupted servers, the distorted glow casting grotesque shadows across the room. The ground trembled beneath the team's feet, as if the entire building was alive and angry. Johnny fired his magnum, the glowing bullets tearing through one of the writhing tendrils. It recoiled with a sharp screech, spraying sparks and fragments of metal across the room. Keep moving, he shouted. We can't let it pin us down. Ren darted to the side, her spear slicing through a cluster of cables reaching for Shade. "These things just keep coming," she yelled, her voice sharp over the roar of the hive. Scotty blasted another tendril with his shotgun, the sound reverberating through the room. "What do we even hit? There's no weak spot." Shade crouched behind a fallen server tower, his call sign glowing as he scanned the room. "The central core. The structure in the middle, it's feeding everything. If we take it out, we shut down the hive." The orphan grinned, reloading his magnum with practiced ease. "Now we're talking. Let's see how tough this thing really is." The team regrouped, their movements synchronized as they advanced toward the pulsating core. The hive fought back with everything it had. Tendrils shot out from the walls and floor, slamming into desks and columns, sending debris flying in every direction. The monitors flickered with distorted images of screaming faces, as if the virus was taunting them. Johnny dodged a tendril aimed at his head, firing 2 quick shots that severed it mid-air. "Shade, can you overload it? Use the servers against the core." Shade nodded, typing furiously on his console. "I'll try, but it's fighting me. The virus has control over everything in here." Ren leapt onto a desk, her spear glowing faintly as she drove it into a cluster of wires feeding into the core. The impact sent a jolt of energy through the room, and the core let out a guttural, mechanical roar. "That did something," she shouted, pulling her spear free. "Hit it harder." The orphan was already moving, weaving through the chaos with a wild grin on his face. "Oh, you're gonna regret waking up today, Hive," he shouted, firing shot after shot into the mass of wires and tissue surrounding the core. Each impact sent sparks flying, but the core seemed to regenerate as quickly as they damaged it. Scotty reloaded his shotgun, blasting another tendril that lunged toward him. "It's not enough. We're barely scratching it." Johnny's call sign flared brighter as he activated free will mode, his vision sharpening as the multiversal threads became visible. He scanned the core, searching for anything that stood out. Then he saw a faint shimmer of multiversal energy buried deep within the pulsating structure. "There," he shouted, pointing toward the center of the core. "It's using multiversal energy to protect itself. That's its weak spot." The orphan's grin widened. "Well, why didn't you say so?" The team refocused their efforts, pushing through the chaos as they targeted the core's center. Shade worked furiously at his console, bypassing the virus's defenses and rerouting power from the surrounding servers. "Almost there," he called out. "Keep it distracted." Johnny led the charge, his magnum glowing brightly as he fired precise shots into the core. Each impact sent waves of energy rippling through the room, the hive screeching in response. Ren's spear slashed through another tendril, her movements fluid and relentless. Scotty provided cover, his shotgun clearing a path as the orphan darted forward, his magnum blazing. "Time to finish this," the orphan shouted, leaping onto a server tower and aiming directly at the core's shimmering center. He fired a single, glowing shot, the bullet streaking through the air like a comet. The bullet struck the core dead center, and the room erupted in a blinding flash of light. The hive let out a deafening, mechanical roar as the tendrils convulsed and collapsed, the monitors shattering into fragments. The ground trembled violently, and the corrupted structure began to disintegrate, its energy dissipating into the air. The team braced themselves as the chaos subsided, the room falling silent except for the faint hum of the call sign network. The core lay in ruins, its once pulsating mass reduced to lifeless debris. Johnny lowered his magnum, his breathing heavy as he surveyed the damage. "Is it over?" Shade checked his console, his call sign glowing faintly. "The hive's offline. The contamination's neutralized." "We did it." Ren let out a sigh of relief, leaning on her spear. "That was too close." The orphan hopped down from the server tower, his grin intact. "Too close is just another way of saying we won." As the team caught their breath, the call sign network flared to life, its voice calm but firm. "Hive neutralized. Contamination severely weakened. Main threat contained, but residual elements remain." Johnny frowned, his gaze narrowing. "Residual elements? What does that mean?" The network's voice was steady but ominous. "The virus is wounded but not destroyed. Further action required. Be prepared." Johnny exchanged a glance with the others, their relief tempered by the weight of the network's words. The fight wasn't over, not yet. Johnny paced back and forth near the remains of the hive, his mind racing as the team regrouped. The call sign network's warning about residual elements lingered in the air, a stark reminder that their fight wasn't finished. Shade knelt by a shattered console, running his hands over the wreckage. "The contamination is weak now, but it's not gone. If we leave it, it'll rebuild itself. Maybe not here, but somewhere else." Ren leaned on her spear, frowning. "So, what's the play?" "We destroyed the hive, but the virus is still out there. We can't just keep fighting pockets of it forever." Johnny stopped pacing and turned to Shade. "What about an EMP?" Scotty blinked, his shotgun resting against his shoulder. "An EMP? You mean, like, wipe it all out?" "That'd take out everything in the area, electronics, systems, maybe even the loom mill if it's close enough." Shade adjusted his console, nodding slowly. "He's right. A localized EMP could fry the remaining contamination, but it'd also destroy everything else. Any tech caught in the blast would be toast." The orphan grinned, leaning against a broken server. "Good ol' scorched earth strategy. I like it. Problem is, we kinda need tech to keep fighting." Johnny's expression hardened. "We wouldn't just launch a standard EMP. We tuned target the bacteria specifically." Ren raised an eyebrow. "You can do that?" Shade tapped his console, his call sign glowing faintly as he thought. It's not impossible. The virus operates on a specific wavelength, blending biological and electronic signals. If we isolate that frequency, we could create a custom EMP that targets it without affecting other systems. Scotty rubbed the back of his neck, skeptical. That sounds risky. What happens if you're wrong? We'd knock out everything, including ourselves. Shade smirked, adjusting his glasses. That's why we test it first. I can run simulations through the call sign network. If we fine-tune the parameters enough, we can make it work. The orphan's grin widened. I like this plan. Big boom, smart boom. Let's do it. Johnny nodded, his resolve firm. All right, Shade. Get started on the simulations. We'll need to pinpoint the strongest concentration of the remaining contamination and set up the EMP device there. If this works, we end this virus for good. Shade set to work, pulling up data on his console as the rest of the team prepared to move out. Ren and Scotty began gathering supplies, while the orphan casually spun his magnum, his excitement evident. Wiping out a techno-virus with a custom EMP, he said, chuckling. Now that's a story worth telling. Johnny's call sign glowed faintly as he stared at the wreckage of the hive. The stakes were high, but this was their best shot. If they could pull this off, they wouldn't just weaken the virus, they'd destroy it completely. And Johnny was determined to see it through. Shade worked furiously at his console, the glow of his call sign illuminating the wreckage around him. Lines of code scrolled rapidly across his screen as he ran simulations, the hum of the call sign network providing an almost comforting background noise. The rest of the team stood nearby, their weapons at the ready, scanning the area for any signs of remaining contamination. This isn't just about building an EMP, Shade muttered, mostly to himself. We're talking about targeting something that's both biological and electronic. It's like threading a needle while blindfolded. Johnny paced nearby, his gaze focused but calm. You're the best we've got, Shade. If anyone can pull this off, it's you. Shade smirked faintly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Flattery won't speed this up, but thanks for the vote of confidence. The orphan leaned against a broken server, spinning his magnum lazily. So, what's the game plan, tech wizard? We just flip a switch and boom, virus gone. Shade glanced up, his expression serious. Not quite. First, we need to isolate the strongest residual contamination. The EMP won't be effective if we just hit random pockets, it has to target the largest concentration of the virus. Ren frowned, her spear resting on her shoulder. And how do we find that? The hive's gone, but the contamination's spread out. Johnny activated free will mode, his call sign glowing brightly. He scanned the area, focusing on the faint multiversal threads that shimmered in the air. "The virus leaves a signature," he said. "We follow it, find where it's hiding, and set the EMP there." Shade nodded. "Exactly. But we'll need a device capable of generating the EMP with pinpoint precision. I can repurpose parts of the hive's remains, but it'll take time." Scotty groaned, resting his shotgun against his shoulder. "Time we might not have. What if the contamination fights back while we're setting up?" The orphan grinned, his magnum gleaming in the dim light. "Then we fight back harder. You know the drill." Hours passed as Shade worked on the EMP device, dismantling components from the hive's remains and salvaging usable parts. Ren and Scotty kept watch, while Johnny and the orphan scouted the surrounding area, their call signs glowing faintly as they tracked the contamination signature. "It's faint," Johnny said, his voice low as he studied the threads of energy. "But it's moving. The residual contamination isn't just lingering, it's consolidating." The orphan frowned, his usual grin replaced by a rare moment of seriousness. "Consolidating? That's not good. Means it's regrouping." Johnny nodded, his jaw tightening. "Which means we need to move fast." Back at the hive's remains, Shade wiped sweat from his brow as he connected the final wires on the EMP device. It was a crude setup, a fusion of salvaged hive tech and components from the team's own equipment, but it pulsed with energy, its core glowing faintly. "It's ready," Shade said, standing and stepping back to admire his work. "This EMP will hit the virus hard, but it's tuned to the specific frequency of the contamination. Other systems should be fine." Ren raised an eyebrow. "Should?" Shade shrugged. "Hey, it's science, not magic." "But I'm confident." Scotty groaned. "Confident doesn't exactly fill me with warm fuzzies." Johnny stepped forward, his call sign glowing brightly. "It'll work. Now we just need to deploy it at the strongest concentration of the contamination." Shade synced the EMP to the call sign network, the device humming faintly. "I'm uploading the coordinates now. Looks like the contamination's gathering, near the old substation outside town." The orphan cracked his knuckles, his grin returning. "A substation, huh? Makes sense. Lots of wires, lots of tech, perfect spot for the virus to regroup." Johnny nodded, his determination unwavering. "Then that's where we'll go. Gear up, everyone. This ends now." The team loaded the EMP into the van and set out toward the substation, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on their shoulders. The road was quiet, the air thick with tension as they approached their destination. As the substation came into view, Johnny activated free will mode, scanning the area. The contamination was stronger here, pulsing faintly in the air like a heartbeat. The wires and structures of the substation shimmered with the virus's signature, its presence undeniable. "This is it," Johnny said, his voice steady. "The heart of what's left." Ren gripped her spear, her expression fierce. "Then let's finish this." The orphan chuckled, spinning his magnum. "Time to make some fireworks." Shade adjusted the EMP, syncing it with the call sign network. "Once we activate this, there's no going back. It'll fry every trace of the contamination in this area." Johnny looked at the team, his gaze firm. "Good. Let's make it count." The EMP began to hum, its core glowing brighter as it prepared to release its devastating pulse. The team braced themselves, their weapons drawn, ready for whatever fight the virus might throw at them. This was it, their last stand against the Techno-Bacterial Virus. And this time, they weren't leaving until it was gone for good. The van rumbled to a stop just outside the perimeter of the old substation. The area was eerily quiet, the faint crackle of electricity from the rusted wires barely audible over the hum of the EMP device. Johnny and the team climbed out, their weapons at the ready, the air around them heavy with tension. Johnny activated free will mode, his call sign pulsing as he scanned the area. The contamination was thick here, swirling around the substation like a malevolent storm. The wires and machinery were alive with the virus's presence, glowing faintly with the same unnatural shimmer they'd seen before. "This is the heart of it," Johnny said, his voice low. "The contamination's feeding on the infrastructure here. We take this out, and we end it." Shade hoisted the EMP device from the back of the van, its core glowing faintly as he set it down carefully. "The EMP's primed and ready," he said. "Once it goes off, it'll wipe out every trace of the contamination in this area." Scotty glanced at the rusted wires and pulsing structures of the substation, his shotgun gripped tightly. "And if it doesn't?" The orphan grinned, spinning his magnum. "Then we improvise. Like we always do." Ren adjusted her spear, her gaze sharp as she scanned the area. "We're not alone. Look." The team turned as a faint, mechanical groaning sound echoed from deeper within the substation. The shadows shifted, and from the tangled mess of wires and machinery emerged several twisted forms. The remnants of the contamination had taken shape, manifesting as warped, half-mechanical creatures with glowing eyes and twitching limbs. "Looks like it doesn't want to go down without a fight," Johnny said, raising his magnum. The orphan cracked his knuckles, his grin widening. "Good. I was hoping for some action." The creatures lunged forward, their movements jerky but fast. The team sprang into action, their training and instincts kicking in immediately. Ren charged ahead, her spear slicing through the first creature with ease, sparks flying as it crumbled into a heap of wires and metal. Scotty fired his shotgun, the blast tearing through two more creatures as they lunged toward him. "There's too many of them," he shouted. Shade ducked behind the EMP, pulling out his console as he began inputting the final commands. "Keep them off me. I need a few more minutes to set this thing off." Johnny and the orphan moved in tandem, their weapons blazing as they cut through the creatures. Johnny's magnum glowed with multiversal energy, each shot striking with pinpoint accuracy, while the orphan moved with a reckless, almost joyful energy, his laughter echoing through the chaos. "You call this a last stand?" the orphan shouted, dodging a clawed swipe from one of the creatures before blasting it apart. "I've fought nightmares scarier than you." The battle raged on as the creatures swarmed, their numbers seemingly endless. Johnny fired another shot, his eyes scanning the area as he shouted to Shade. "How much longer?" "Almost there," Shade called back, his fingers flying over the console. "Just keep them off me a little longer." Ren and Scotty formed a defensive line in front of Shade, their weapons cutting down any creatures that got too close. Ren's spear glinted as it slashed through metal and wires, while Scotty's shotgun roared with each pull of the trigger. Johnny's call sign pulsed brighter as he stepped forward, his voice steady. "Orphan. With me. Let's clear a path." The orphan grinned, his magnum spinning as he followed Johnny into the thick of the fight. The two Vandukes moved like a storm, their combined firepower tearing through the creatures and pushing them back. Shade's voice cut through the chaos. "EMP is ready. Everyone, get clear." The team scrambled back as Shade hit the final command. The EMP began to pulse, its core glowing brighter and brighter until it unleashed a massive wave of energy. The pulse ripped through the substation, the air crackling with power as the contamination writhed and shrieked. The creatures collapsed instantly, their forms disintegrating into piles of lifeless wires and metal. The shimmering contamination in the air dissolved, fading into nothingness as the EMP's energy washed over the area. When the light faded, the substation was silent. The twisted structures and corrupted machinery were still, their glowing pulses extinguished. The team stood in the aftermath, their weapons lowered as they caught their breath. "It's done," Shade said, his voice filled with relief. "The contamination's gone." Johnny deactivated free will mode, his call sign dimming as he surveyed the area. "Let's hope that's the last of it." The orphan holstered his magnum, a satisfied grin on his face. "Not bad, team. Not bad at all." Ren leaned on her spear, her gaze wary. "We should head back to the mill. If the network picks up anything else, we'll need to be ready." Johnny nodded, his determination unwavering. "Agreed. Let's go." As they made their way back to the van, the air felt lighter, as if the weight of the virus's presence had finally lifted. But Johnny couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one battle in a much larger war. The imposter and the false storyteller were still out there, and the fight was far from over. But for now, they had won. And they were ready for whatever came next. The drive back to the loom mill was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence. The team sat in tired contemplation, the weight of what they had just faced still fresh in their minds. The faint glow of the call signs on their arms pulsed gently, a reminder of the battle they had won. Johnny stared out the passenger window, his magnum resting on his lap. The fields and scattered buildings of Lancaster passed by in a blur, their familiarity a strange comfort after the chaos of the substation. The orphan broke the silence first, his voice light but tinged with exhaustion. "Well, that was fun. Nothing like a techno-virus and some killer machines to liven up the day." Scotty groaned from the back, slumping against his seat. "Fun? I feel like I just wrestled a bear made of wires." Ren leaned her spear against the door, her gaze focused out the window. "We're lucky it worked. If that EMP hadn't been tuned right." Shade glanced back from the driver's seat, his tone calm but firm. "It worked because we made it work. That's how we survive, by staying sharp and figuring things out. But let's not kid ourselves. This was a close one." Johnny nodded, his voice quiet but resolute. "Too close. We need to keep pushing, keep learning. The imposter and the false storyteller won't stop, and neither can we." The loom mill came into view as the van rounded the final corner. The familiar sight of the towering structure brought a sense of relief, its renovated facade standing as a beacon of safety amidst the chaos they faced. They pulled into the lot, the van rumbling to a halt. Johnny stepped out first, taking a deep breath of the cool night air. The mill's lights glowed faintly, the hum of its generators a reassuring sound. "Home sweet home," the orphan said, stretching as he hopped out of the van. "Let's hope it stays that way." The team unloaded their gear in silence, their movements efficient despite their exhaustion. Ren placed her spear in its usual spot by the workbench, while Scotty set his shotgun down with a sigh. Shade powered up the consoles, the call sign network flickering to life. "I'll run some diagnostics, make sure there's no lingering contamination in the system." Johnny nodded, his gaze sweeping over the mill. "Good. Let's take a breather, but stay ready. We don't know what's coming next." The orphan plopped down in a salvaged chair, spinning his magnum idly. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it. We always do." Johnny allowed himself a small smile, the weight of leadership still heavy on his shoulders but tempered by the strength of his team. "Yeah. We will." As the team settled in for the night, the loom mill stood as their fortress, their sanctuary in a world that seemed to grow darker with every passing day. For now, they were safe. But they all knew the fight was far from over. Johnny leaned against one of the mill's railings, the faint hum of the call sign network filling the background. The rest of the team had dispersed, tending to their gear or grabbing some much-needed rest. He turned his gaze to the orphan, who stood a few feet away, idly spinning his magnum and staring at the faint glow of the multiversal threads visible only to those who knew how to look. "Orphan," Johnny said, his voice quiet but firm. "I need to ask you something." The orphan glanced up, his grin faltering slightly as he saw the seriousness in Johnny's expression. What's on your mind, boss? Johnny straightened, folding his arms. The imposter. Why does he hate you so much? I mean, it's clear he has a problem with all of us, but with you, it feels personal. The orphan's grin disappeared entirely, replaced by a look Johnny hadn't seen before, something between regret and a deep, abiding anger. He sighed, holstering his magnum and leaning back against the railing. Yeah, the orphan said after a moment, his voice quieter than usual. It's personal. You could say we have history. Johnny waited, giving him space to continue. After a long pause, the orphan spoke again, his tone low and somber. I killed him, the orphan said, his words cutting through the quiet air. During the war, I was the one who ended him. Johnny's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. The orphan continued, his gaze fixed on the faint threads of energy flickering around the mill. The imposter wasn't just another enemy in the war. He was the one who destroyed my timeline. My world, my Lancaster, it's gone, Johnny. From point A to point B, every single second of it. Dead, faded, absorbed into his chaos. He didn't just attack it, he erased it. Johnny's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. Erased? Like, completely gone. The orphan nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. Completely. My world can't progress. It can't heal. It's stuck, frozen in time, and there's nothing left of it but me. That's why I'm like this, why I'm stuck as a 13-year-old forever. Johnny's eyes widened. You mean? Yeah, the orphan interrupted, his tone bitter but steady. That's why I don't age. That's why I'm always traveling through timelines. My Lancaster, my everything is dead. Every year, every month, every week, every day, gone. Just a hollow shell where I was born. He paused, his voice faltering slightly as he continued. And that's why the imposter hates me. Because I'm the one who killed him. I didn't do it out of duty or strategy or some noble cause. I did it because he took everything from me. Johnny leaned forward, his voice soft. And you survived. The orphan let out a humorless chuckle. If you can call this surviving. Unlike the other Vandukes, I don't have versions of myself scattered across timelines, older, younger, divergent. There's no past me, no future me. There's just me. One orphan. One version of myself, stuck in a body that never grows, in a life that never changes. He turned to Johnny, his eyes shadowed with a mix of anger and resignation. That's why I'm the orphan. Not just because I lost my world, but because I don't belong anywhere. When I die, there's no one else to take my place. No timeline to spin off a new version of me. Just like the Starfield Vanduke and the Hell Rider Vanduke, when I'm gone, that's it. No legacy. Just nothing. Johnny felt a weight settle in his chest, the enormity of the orphan's words pressing down on him. "But you're still here," he said quietly. "You're still fighting." The orphan's grin returned, but it was faint and tinged with sadness. "Yeah, I'm still here. And I'll keep fighting until I'm not. Because if I stop, if I let him win, then everything I've been through, everything I've lost, it's all for nothing." The orphan leaned back against the railing, his face darkened by the weight of his memories. He took a deep breath, his eyes distant as he stared into the faint glow of the call sign network's energy threads. Johnny waited, knowing this wasn't a story that could be rushed. "I remember," the orphan began, his voice softer than usual, "back when the war first started, it wasn't a full-blown war. It was a slow burn. We didn't even know who or what we were fighting yet. Everything felt off. Like the multiverse itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap." Johnny stayed silent, watching as the orphan's expression hardened, his words taking on a sharper edge. "At the time, I was already dealing with my own nightmares, killer animatronics, the man behind the slaughter, the mess at the pizzeria. Then, out of nowhere, this other place shows up. A whole new location, sister location. Another building of animatronics, another nightmare waiting to happen. I couldn't do it alone, so I called in help." He glanced at Johnny, his eyes flickering with a faint, bitter smile. That's when Street Rat showed up. He wasn't just any Vanduke, he was sharp, resourceful, knew how to move through the cracks of the multiverse like it was second nature. We thought it was just another mission. Just another twisted location to clean up. The orphan's fingers tightened around the railing, his voice growing heavier. But when we got there, something was wrong. The animatronics weren't just acting up, they were infected. Corrupted by something we couldn't see. At first, we thought it was just a virus or a rogue AI. But then Street Rat told me about something he'd been seeing in the call sign network, something wrong. A flicker, a glitch. Like the network was being manipulated. Johnny raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. You're saying the imposter was already in the network? The orphan nodded grimly. Yeah, but we didn't know that then. We had no idea who or what he was. Street Rat left to investigate another lead in a different timeline. Said he'd seen signs of the same corruption popping up in other places. He figured we'd regroup later and share what we'd found. He paused, his voice lowering. But later that day, everything changed. That's when the bio-slaves came. Johnny's eyes narrowed. The bio-slaves were the imposter's army. Yeah, the orphan confirmed, his voice tinged with bitterness. But at the time, we didn't know that either. All we knew was that they came out of nowhere, and they were unstoppable. They tore through my timeline like it was paper. Earth's buildings crumbled, the atmosphere dissolved, the world stopped turning. The ground split open, swallowing entire cities. Rivers and lakes dried up, and everything turned to rot and ruin. The orphan took a shaky breath, his eyes clouded with the memories. I fought off one bio-slave, just one, and it nearly killed me. By the time I realized what was happening, my world was already gone. The people, the cities, everything, just gone. Absorbed into the imposter's chaos. Johnny frowned, his call sign glowing faintly. You said you were saved. By another Vanduke. The orphan nodded, his voice steady but filled with reverence. Yeah. The Vanduke of Universe 7. He wasn't just powerful, he was something else entirely. The kind of power that made you feel like nothing could touch him. He pulled me out of the ruins of my timeline and got me to the Denmark. Johnny's brow furrowed. The den. The orphan's gaze flickered to Johnny, a faint smirk returning to his lips. The den. The central hub of the call sign network. It's where Vandukes from across the multiverse meet, plan, regroup. It's the only place where the network's power is absolute. He looked away, his smirk fading. By the time we got there, my timeline was gone. Erased completely. The den couldn't save it, and the imposter had moved on. That's why I'm stuck like this, Johnny. That's why I'll always be the youngest Vanduke. My timeline can't progress. It's frozen, dead, and so am I. The orphan's voice grew softer, tinged with a quiet resignation. Other Vandukes have versions of themselves, older, younger, divergent spin-offs. They're scattered across timelines, part of something bigger. But me? There's just me. One orphan. One version. When I die, there's no one else. No other timeline to pick up the pieces. Johnny stared at him, his voice quiet but firm. But you're still here. You're still fighting. The orphan let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, I'm still here. But only because the den gave me a purpose. To fight the imposter, the false storyteller, and anything else that threatens the multiverse. As long as I'm alive, I'll fight. But I know how this ends. When I'm gone, that's it. No legacy. Just another dead Vanduke, like the Starfield Vanduke and the Hell Rider. He turned to Johnny, his usual grin returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. So now you know why the imposter hates me. Why I'm stuck like this. Why I fight like I've got nothing to lose because I don't. Johnny nodded slowly, his voice steady. But you do have something. You've got us. You've got this fight. And as long as you're here, you're not alone. The orphan chuckled, shaking his head. Careful, boss. You're starting to sound like a leader. Johnny smirked, his call sign glowing faintly. Maybe I am.